Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. And this is Geoff Aberdeen, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister, Alex Salmond. Hello, Geoff.
Good morning. I'm trying.
And here's Andy Maciver, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Good afternoon. No, I mean good morning. It's definitely the morning.
It's very much the morning. In fact, it's just after 5:30 on Wednesday morning, to be honest with you, as you're listening to this. Our diaries were a complete nightmare this week, so here we are, 5:30 in the actual morning, recording for you. If you'd like to send thank you messages, then please feel free to do so. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for putting up with our morning voices. And I hope you enjoy the analysis today as you listen to the pod. We're going to discuss, various election issues around Caerphilly, around the framing of the Scottish parliamentary election as well. Also today, several of you have been asking why there is a sort of perceived disparity between council by-election results in Scotland compared to the national polling, and specifically around the SNP, actually. So we will assess that for you, and we'll actually give you some answers on that too. And the Labour government are going to move migrants out of hotels and into Cameron Barracks in Inverness, among other locations, which, as you might imagine, has caused a little bit of controversy. So we'll assess that for you as well. Thank you for finding us. Press subscribe on whatever app you are listening or watching if you're on YouTube, and subscribe to our mailing list at holyroodsources.com, because if you are subscribed there, you'd have already had a week's head up on this news that our Christmas pub quiz is happening. It's confirmed. Sponsored by Diageo, which, by the way, means you're going to get a free Guinness when you show up. Or perhaps a Guinness Zero if you're not on the booze around the start of December. And the prizes are exceptionally good. That's all I can say, but there were messages being exchanged yesterday about what those prizes will be for the winning teams. We're going to be reviewing the year in Scottish politics with you at Malone's Pub in Edinburgh on the 2nd of December, and we will actually be recording our Christmas special podcast first. So that'll be 30 minutes, and then we'll get into the pub quiz from there on out. So you can come and take part. You can buy a ticket for yourself or for a whole team, and your team can really be any size, but a maximum of 8 people. Because that's how big the tables are. So it would just get difficult if it was more than that. So a maximum of 8, but it can be any number. And if you come by yourself, we'll match you up with other people, hopefully. This is the first time we're doing this. We're just going to give it a try and get our heads down and get on with it. To get your ticket, go to holyroodsources.com/live. Let's begin in Caerphilly after the Senedd by-election there, where Labour suffered its first parliamentary defeat for 100 years, and Plaid Cymru claimed victory in that Welsh Parliament by-election. Geoff, it's obviously a few months before the full Senedd is elected during the May elections, but what's your take on the significance of the Caerphilly result?
Well, it's very significant because obviously we're so close to an election, as you point out, not just in Wales, but in Scotland and local elections in England as well. And if that's in any way to instruct that result, any way to instruct what happens in May, then Labour are in for a really, really tough time. A few observations. Firstly, there's a big clamouring around commentariat and indeed the opposition of reform to say that reform were humiliated. No, they weren't. They had a massive increase in their vote, 34% from 2021. That's pretty good going. I do think, however, that said, that they didn't manage their expectations very well. I thought it was interesting in the Hamilton Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election earlier on in the year, where they actually went into the contest and said, I don't think we're going to win this. We're going to have a strong challenge. I think that would be much better to do it that way in Wales as well, whereas they put themselves front and centre, expecting to win. But nonetheless, it is a big result for them because their vote went up so much. Again, my second observation linked to that, though, is that they may have a ceiling. And it does look like Plaid Cymru voters and indeed Labour voters lent their vote to Plaid Cymru to keep reform out. That's something to look ahead to as well, with May in mind. Will that happen to try and see what happens in terms of tactical voting? Final point, though, is Labour were the ones that were actually humiliated. They were trounced in this contest, and that will be very, very worrying for Keir Starmer. I believe that when you receive such a hammering like that, you look to your leader for a little bit of direction. You look for some solace. You look for, right, what are we going to do to pick ourselves up from this? And I noticed on his Twitter account, during polling day, actually, he had 3 tweets on digital ID cards. Whatever your views on that policy, it's not a particularly popular one just now. It's hotly contested, let's say, at best. And then on the morning after the polling day, I noticed that he wrote, "Digital ID cards will bring the UK into the modern age. Well, your party's just suffered a humiliation for the ages, and you're sitting there talking about a policy totally unrelated to what's happened." Now, I can see a strategy where you might say, well, let's not talk about the bad news, but I just felt it was completely disconnected with reality. And I thought that was very instructive as well. Didn't want to confront the issue of the day and say to the voters, look, we're listening. We will get better. We're going to be a party of national renewals, he likes to say. At least take
Cling
on
to the lines.
Yeah, I just found that really, really interesting. And if I was a Labour Party member, or indeed a Labour Party parliamentarian, I'd be a bit miffed that he's chosen to go on to ID cards in the day after he received a really big hammering.
Yeah. So the results, so Plaid 47.4%, Reform UK 36%, Labour 11%, the Conservatives 2%, and then the rest underneath. I mean, Andy, there's a part of this as well. Labour and the Conservatives combined had 13% of the vote. That, you know, these kind of alleged 2 main parties were absolutely nowhere in this.
I think so. I agree with Geoff about Reform not being humiliated here. That wasn't the case at all. I do, though, think that it was a warning for Reform just about the power of tactical voting, because what you clearly had is huge numbers of Labour voters deciding to nip over to Plaid in order to stop Reform. And I think it just goes to show in Wales what we've already seen years and years ago in Scotland, that Labour voters and the voters of the Nationalist Party are not all that far apart. They're essentially, you know, soft leftish social democratic voters. Who believe largely either in decentralisation or some form of greater independence. And so it isn't difficult for a Labour vote to shift to Plaid Cymru, as we saw. That being said, it is a by-election, and votes shift around in by-elections a lot easier than they shift around in real elections. So, I mean, I think although it's a warning sign for Reform, the polls are still the polls, and Reform are still neck and neck with Plaid Cymru to actually get the win in that election next year. I just find it fascinating, the fall of the 2 main parties. I mean, we have spoken about it at various points over the last 100 years as to whether there's going to be a major realignment in political parties. We spoke about it in the 80s with the SDP. We even spoke about it with Change UK not that long ago under Corbyn. But the 2 main parties have always prevailed, and have always between them got, you know, 80-odd% of the vote. Those days might be gone. I mean, we might genuinely be in territory now where they're finished, and neither of them will ever get that sort of 40% number again, because this, you know, Reform are just wreaking absolute havoc all over the country. And it looks like the Reform vote is stickier than really any other third-party vote that we've seen in our lifetime.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree with you, Andy, there. I think my point was that, you know, because I mentioned that Reform might have a ceiling because of tactical voting, and people might come together to try and keep them out. But at the end of the day, you know, if they're going to record 36% nationally, they're horsing an election, right? Let's be clear, across England. So it was a good result for them. I just think that their expectation management was off tactically. And I say again, you know, Labour and Tories.
Yeah.
What a realignment we could be facing, as you say.
An interesting thing just on Plaid is that they have promised to publish a plan for Welsh independence, but not within the first term of any Plaid-led government beyond May 2026. This came from the party conference, and the plan is to set up what's called a standing commission to talk to the public about the future of the country, and then they would pursue the idea. They say it's kind of suggested if they won both the 2026 and 2030 Senedd elections. And I just wanted a thought on that, obviously with a kind of Scottish lens on it, as a strategy to sort of say, we're going to work towards that, but not if we win in 2026.
Well, Calum, if you remember in 2007,
Yep.
when the SNP were elected minority government, we knew we didn't have the votes to put forward a real prospectus for independence or indeed have a referendum. So we entered a national conversation, which was a consultation with the people of Scotland about what their views on what Scotland should look like. It got criticised quite heavily, incidentally, by our opposition in the commentariat for being a national blether. But nonetheless, actually, it was a very useful exercise internally for us because we got quite a lot of responses, not as many as we would like, let's be honest, but a lot of responses which actually did aid our positioning for 2011. And so I kind of think what Plaid Cymru are doing is quite similar to that. So easy as she goes, guys. Easy as she goes. We're not going to throw this down your throats just now. And there might be a lesson in there for John Swinney. Who knows? But obviously, you've got to remember that the parties are in two different stages in their journey. You know, Plaid Cymru have never really been in government, so that there is a difference there. But it does remind me of that when I read that.
Yeah, it's an interesting approach.
I think the other thing to remember as well is that independence in Wales is. Sentiment for independence in Wales is really nowhere near what it is in Scotland.
Yeah.
It's more similar to what it was in Scotland 20 years ago than what it is just now. I mean, I don't think that the yes vote has ever won a poll in Wales on independence or even come particularly close. I mean, the polls have tightened in Wales a little bit because of recent events, which I suppose is inevitable. But you're talking really about the no vote in Wales having 20 or 30 point leads consistently for, well, ever, really. So the independence debate in Wales is just not in the same place. I think the interesting thing, though, Calum, is that, I mean, yeah, I put that tweet out last week after the Caerphilly by-election, where I said that, you know, if the polls are correct, by 2030 we could have nationalists running Scotland, nationalists running Wales, nationalists running Northern Ireland, and English nationalists running Westminster. And I think that maybe slightly goes to show that this might come upon Wales slightly by accident, and they may have to prepare a little bit more quickly if sentiment shifts very quickly, because we're in a political era where sentiments are shifting very, very quickly, and you just never know what might happen in the not too distant future and all this.
And just on Andy's mega tweet about the situation facing the UK potentially the next few months, I noticed that co-hosts of the Other Sources podcast all piled in with their thoughts on your take, Andy. I feel like there's potential for a mega podcast at some point to sort of set it all in its context over the next few months. So watch this space and we can join up on Holyrood and Stormont and Whitehall and Senedd Sources for your listening pleasure as well. Right, we asked on Twitter yesterday what you wanted us to talk about on the pod this week, and a couple of things stood out. One that I will just sort of fess up has broken a bit too late given our early recording time for us to piece together. This is exclusive reporting in the Daily Mail that parliamentary police officers have ordered a director of For Women Scotland to attend a police station to face vandalism charges over a broken umbrella after a complaint by a trans activist. So this is Susan Smith, who has been on this podcast, who is 1/3 of For Women Scotland. They, of course, took the Scottish Government to the Supreme Court over their definition of a woman and won. She's been accused of minor damage to an umbrella at a rally outside the Scottish Parliament last month. So in honesty, I woke up at 5:15 this morning with several of you suggesting we should be discussing this, and obviously we've just not been able to sort of put it all together and get a guest and all of that sort of stuff. But you can read more about that in the Daily Mail this morning if you would like to, and it's something to which we'll return. Of course, in a connected story, we're awaiting the outcome of the Sandy Peggy Tribunal, which is something.
And viewers on YouTube will already have Geoff and I's instinctive answer via our facial expressions. We don't need to discuss it.
You can probably piece together what the instant reaction is.
Geoff actually gave a spoken answer there as well, I think.
Anyway, but yes, so apologies for that, but that's just a logistics thing. But I mean, it sounds like a completely ridiculous story in terms of the facts of it are ridiculous. I mean, let's read it in the Daily Mail. It is something to which we'll return. The other thing that several of you replied to us on X about, Kenneth and William specifically. Kenneth said, SNP polling and council election results discrepancies, perhaps. And William said, why the SNP have lost the last 7 by-elections, but we are to believe they are in the lead on polls. Andy, shall I come to you first on this? this sort of perception of discrepancy, trying to match the polls to realities. And I will say at this point, we've had some help from friend of the pod, Mark McGagan from Ipsos, on how the data kind of all plays out on this one as well. So, Andy, how would you like to respond to Kenneth and William when it comes to any perception of discrepancy here?
Well, I suppose the first basic point to make to Kenneth and William is that, in a sense, they're right, because the real polls are the ones that give you the best indication of what's actually going on. I mean, I think it's fair to say in this, also, you're talking about different electoral systems here. So that
Yes.
it also makes it quite difficult, okay? Because council elections are run on a completely different electoral system to Holyrood elections, and that can change quite a lot about what it looks like in terms of first preferences. And comparing that, I think, to Holyrood elections, far less Westminster elections, is pretty difficult to do, I think. But I do think a couple of things are pretty clear from council polls and from opinion polls, which is that although the SNP look like they're going to relatively easily win this election in May, their vote share is very significantly down on what it was in 2021. I mean, nobody can really argue with that. They are, depending which poll you look at, they are 10 to 15 points light of where they were in 2021. Ironically, their seat projections are still very high, and that is thanks to one Mr. N. Farage, but I'm sure they will not particularly want to acknowledge that. Effectively, the SNP are, in a lot of constituencies, potentially coming through the middle here, because Farage is taking quite a lot of votes from, well, he's taking votes from everybody, but he's taking more votes from the others than he is from the SNP. One other thing to mention, though, which I think is relevant, is that you obviously take it with a pinch of salt because it's from the opposition, but I've got quite a lot of Labour people and quite a lot of Lib Dem people telling me that they feel that the SNP vote share is being overdone in the polls, that they're a bit overcooked, and that actually on the ground they are not polling the sort of numbers that the opinion polling says they are. Now, there's an awful lot of you get this at election times, an awful lot of people on the doorsteps saying this is not what I'm hearing in the real world and all that sort of stuff. And sometimes they are speaking to their own echo chamber, so it's not always entirely accurate. But I think it's relevant enough that quite a lot of Labour and SNP people are Labour and Lib Dem people, pardon me, are more optimistic that the SNP are not going to get quite the numbers that the opinion polling makes it look like they are.
Yeah. Shall I give you a bit of Mark McGagan's analysis on this as well? So he says the SNP have won 25.7% of first preferences in council by-elections since the 2024 general election, compared to their current average polling of around 35% of the constituency vote and 29%, or around 29% of the list vote. So that's a gap of 9 points and 3 points respectively. For comparison, at the time of the 2022 Scottish local elections, the SNP were polling at around 44% of the constituency vote and around 34% of the list vote. They won 34.1% of first preferences, so that is a smaller gap to the list vote. Statistically, it's non-existent, but a bigger gap on the constituency vote of around 10 points. So the data wouldn't suggest that the polling is inconsistent with the local by-election results since last July, even though there is a gap. He says, why is there a gap? A few reasons, some of which you've already heard. Firstly, different voting systems. STV removes an amount of tactical or strategic voting. I think this is why the list vote polling is closer to the aggregated council by-election polling. Secondly, regional variation in polling behaviour between national and local elections. For example, says Mark, we know that voters in Nigel and Anir, the Western Isles, Orkney, Shetland and lots of the Highlands will vote for local independents in council elections, but a major party nationally. He also says there's a tendency to use local elections, whether they're by-elections or not, to give governing parties a kicking. Geoff, what do you think? Is there any cause for alarm for the SNP here?
Well, firstly, I think I'm glad that you went to Andy, then had Mark McGee's analysis, and then went to me, because I think I agree with Mark on this pretty much 100%.
I think me and Mark basically said the same thing, did we not? I think we said the same thing, just in a different way.
I was about to say exactly what Mark said. No, that's really interesting, and actually, because it is a question that comes up quite a lot. Listen, a couple of thoughts. I'm not going to go too far from what Andy's just said here, I pick up quite similar sentiment around the population, and I think that there's soft votes. And listen, I think the vote is soft for the SNP. I think they're the best of a bad bunch just now. I don't think there's great enthusiasm for them. That's starting to change slightly when you have conversations with your peer group up and down the country, whenever you go around, particularly in the business community. They're starting to see a little bit of a reason to vote for the SNP, feel that John may be responding to the position of First Minister a bit better. But I also believe the vote for Labour is very soft. And I think that that's the problem, because that's more likely to go to Reform than it is to the SNP. So all that said, I think things are a lot tighter. I do agree with that. And I think it's all to play for. It's just this surge of reform. How far will that go in Scotland, and how does that impact the final result? That's the bit that's the great unknown. Calum.
Yeah, indeed.
I mean, just one small extra thing to add. I think still one of the biggest factors in this election in Scotland is that the mainstream parties either don't or refuse to understand why people want to vote Reform. And as long as they either don't understand or refuse to understand why people want to vote Reform, strange things will happen that the parties don't expect.
Just a couple of very quick things, because Paul Hutcheon, who is the political editor at the Daily Record, posted on X this week, recent events convinced me that there will be two main strands of the Holyrood election. One, John Swinney putting the SNP as leaders of the anti-reform coalition, and two, Anas Sarwar putting Labour at the front of the anti-SNP coalition. Who controls the narrative will become First Minister. Is that the right framing, do you think, Geoff? That actually there's kind of, can we say it like this, there's sort of two enemies in inverted commas, Reform and the SNP, and depending on who you don't like the most, you'll vote either SNP or Labour.
Yeah, I saw what Paul Hutcheon wrote. I've got a lot of time for Paul. I've mentioned him a lot of times on this podcast. I agree with him on the Labour positioning. I think they're already out of the traps on that to say, look, SNP have failed you for 17, 18 years. Now's a time for change. And that's pretty clear. That's their strategy, and it's probably the best one open to them, in all honesty, at this time, because you can't extol the virtues of your colleagues at Westminster, clearly. But on the anti-reform coalition, I'd be quite wary of that. For the SNP being seen as leaders of that coalition. Why? Well, we just have to look back at the Scottish by-election in the summer, where the SNP were seemingly, it seemed to be on track to win that contest. They were putting forward their perspectives, which was twofold. Firstly, the Labour Party took away the child benefit cap. We'll reinstore it, and it was quite policy heavy, and they were talking about what they were doing to try and stand up for Scotland, or stand up for that constituency. There's a mantra I think I'm going to use again. They then pivoted in that contest to be all about Nigel Farage. We're the best people to stand up to Nigel Farage. Well, a reminder for our listeners, the SNP lost that by-election to Labour. John Swinney will be very conscious of that, going into a national contest and trying to be simply anti-reformers. Yes, it can be part of your narrative, but far better to be focusing on your principal opposition, which is still the Labour Party, in my opinion, and being able to say, we're standing up for Scotland. You guys aren't doing it. Look at what you're doing at Westminster. We've tried to mitigate, we've tried to ameliorate, be a bit more self-deprecating and say, look, we haven't got everything right, but we can truly stand up for Scotland. Don't have to look over our shoulders to Westminster. Certainly could do it better than Nigel Farage, who's an English nationalist or something like that. You know, that's how the narrative should play. I wouldn't solely go for an anti-reform positioning, because I'm not sure that would be successful. And the Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election proves that.
I think that's, I mean, that kind of links to what I was saying before, I guess, which is that, you know, the body politic in Scotland wants to think that a very anti-reform position will work very well. What if it doesn't? because again, they want to believe that reform voters are something that they're not. And this is the difficulty, I think. Now, if you look at this sort of 55% of people who didn't vote SNP last time, how many of them are massively exercised by being anti-reform? I don't know. Maybe some Labour people could be convinced, a little bit like they did in Caerphilly. Maybe some Labour people could be convinced to nip over to the SNP and hold their nose a little bit because they think it's the best chance of somebody beating reform. If you look at the numbers, it just feels overplayed to me.
And Andy, just on that though, it's a national election as well, where your government's record is up for grabs. It's being it's being challenged. It's being reviewed, and to simply say, right, we're anti-reform, it just doesn't cut it for me. You're going to have debates. You're going to have discussions locally and nationally on your government's performance. You have to defend that record. And you also have to point out why you're better to stand up to this Labour government than another Labour Party, your principal opponents. Then you can move into the reform stuff by saying, if you think Labour are bad, bloody hell, what a threat from Nigel Farage and reform and this extremist agenda. Fine, you can do that. But I actually think just to purely position yourself as anti-Nigel Farage, anti-reform, would be a bit of a mistake, a tactical error, actually. And I just don't think people would be particularly pleased to see that and wouldn't respond well to it, actually.
I just want to do a very quick thought on story concerning Inverness and Cameron Barracks, and indeed a backlash to plans to house temporarily around 300 asylum seekers at Cameron Barracks in Inverness. The Scottish Government and 3 senior Highland councillors and local MP Angus Macdonald from the Liberal Democrats have all expressed their concerns. The councillors from Highland Council said in a joint statement, "Our main concern is the impact this proposal will have on community cohesion, given the scale of the proposals as they currently stand. Inverness is a relatively small community, but the potential impact locally and across the wider Highlands appears not to have been taken into consideration by the UK government." Scotland's Social Justice Secretary Shirley-Anne Somerville said the Scottish Government had urged the Home Office to work closely with Highland Council. What struck me about this, actually, I was having discussions about it on air, on the radio yesterday, and there was an assumption that the barracks was nowhere close to anything, but actually it's right in the city centre of Inverness, Cameron Barracks. It's about a 10-minute walk from the high street. There are several schools nearby. It's close to the main hospital. I mean, it's right there in the thick of the action. Andy, the Prime Minister's defended the UK government's plans to put asylum seekers here. He said he was planning to house 300 men to get people out of the kind of notorious asylum hotels. This is one of the totemic issues of our time, and whatever location it is, whether it's a hotel or a barracks, they immediately become a flashpoint and a focal point for people's concerns about immigration, and that is now being brought into the city centre of Inverness.
And it's almost self-fulfilling. So I think it was true in the past to say that immigration was largely a political problem in England. And I think polling reflected that. If you look at polling in Scotland, immigration was nowhere near as high a concern as it was in England. But, we inhale national news in this country. It's not just Scottish news. We inhale UK news. It is the issue that is all over the UK news. And, let's see what happens here. I'm as soon as I saw this yesterday, I thought, oh, that's politically quite interesting, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
We, I guess, in Scotland have a little bit of moral superiority about this issue. And I think we like to think that this is not a problem. And I hope that's right, frankly. I hope it isn't a problem, but I am not convinced. And I think we would all be right to be slightly concerned about what the reaction might be in Inverness towards this. As you say, it's becoming the totemic issue of our times, and perhaps that totemic issue is no longer just confined to England. I think it's maybe up here to a pretty high degree as well.
I just wanted to add that you mentioned Inverness. There's been a story in Aberdeen recently where asylum seekers have been moved from hotels, from one in West Hill, for example, into student flats in the city centre. And the co-leader of Aberdeen City Council, the SNP, said that he was frustrated at the Home Office. He would have thought they would have understood the situation in Aberdeen and would make sure that we take account not only of the community but also the safety of the asylum seekers. The problem here, guys, is it's very easy to be quite virtuous and say, right, we welcome asylum seekers, we must have them here. And then suddenly when this situation happens and it's moved into your direct community, there are concerns being voiced by the very same people that have said we must be welcoming. And I think my point here is we have to be able to look at this issue in a non-reform agenda, going back to what Andy said earlier on in the discussion, and say, okay, how do we accommodate and be able to support this community, but at the same time remember that we have existing residents, existing community members that may be concerned about it, and accept that there are concerns about it. This is the point. Accept that there is an issue here that of concern about use of public services, try and educate people on that, and where necessary, actually try and alleviate and say, no, okay, we have to represent the interests of our community here. We have to look at other options here. And actually, this is about tackling the issue head on and not just framing it as, in a reform way of saying, well, this lot are all racist, xenophobic, or all the rest. People genuinely have concerns, and to ignore them, I think you ignore them at your peril, because you just play in to the reform agenda when you do that. And we're going to see this tested out in our communities in Scotland pretty soon. And that's, to Andy's point again, we will find out how this goes down. Very interesting.
Yeah, it truly is. Thanks both. Thanks for the early alarm. Thanks for the early analysis as well, Andy and Geoff. Thank you for your questions. We are saving up quite a few of your questions, actually. We'll do a special kind of Q&A episode in the next few weeks. But of course, you can have your say on anything we're talking about anytime. You can email us, hello@holyroodsources.com, or you can WhatsApp us on 0333 404 6507. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you for watching. Make sure you get your tickets for the Christmas pub quiz. Go to holyroodsources.com/live. We look forward to seeing you there on the 2nd of December. Get it in your diary now, and we will see you in a few weeks' time. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back in your feed again next week.